Hi, I'm Brian Boyd. I'm a fifth-year doctoral candidate at the university here. Just want to introduce our panelists today. First up is Marcus Mescher. Professor Mescher is an associate professor of Christian ethics at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. He specializes in Catholic social thought and moral formation. Marcus is the author of dozens of articles for popular audiences in academic publications, as well as the monograph, The Ethics of Encounter, Christian Neighbor Love as a Practice of Solidarity. Marcus is also a co-principal investigator for a research grant from Fordham University's Taking Responsibility Initiative, aiming to measure moral injury caused by clergy sexual abuse and its concealment. He's working on a book project focusing on the relationship between moral injury and moral conscience. Please welcome Dr. Mescher.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Brian, and to David and Kim for the invitation to be with all of you. I'm really delighted to be here and very honored to share some of the things that I've learned from walking with survivors of clergy sexual abuse over the last few years. I had the great honor of studying with Gustavo Gutierrez and as a graduate student, and for Gustavo, when he's talking about the preferential option for the poor, he always reminds us that the poor is not just an economic concept, that we're talking about the socially insignificant, the powerless, the non-persons of our day. And Gustavo would beseech us that we had to adopt the example of the Samaritan who goes into the ditch to accompany those who've been rendered non-persons, insignificant and powerless, to take their vantage point and to make it our own. And as Brian mentioned, my area of specialty is in Catholic social teaching, and I wrote my dissertation on solidarity. And as Dr. Besti talked about in the opening plenary, I felt morally compelled that I had to go into the ditch and share life with survivors if they would allow me to. And so what I intend to share here is not intended to just trade on their stories or to be a voyeur into a world that is not mine. I've learned that every survivor that I have the chance to listen to, their story is unique to them, and every survivor story you hear is only one survivor's story, and they really do vary quite a bit. As Brian mentioned, I am a co-principal investigator on a 2-year study to try to measure moral injury caused by clergy sexual abuse. And in the work that we've been doing, we've really been shocked to see that clergy sexual abuse is far more pervasive and powerful than we imagined. For example, we surveyed Xavier undergraduate students to hopefully be our control group to compare against survivors who identified themselves to us and people who work for parishes or schools who might feel like implicated subjects because they work for and represent the church. We weren't expecting Xavier students to be, to have any survivors, and yet in our data collection, at least 4 Xavier undergraduates, right now currently identified themselves to us as survivors of clergy sexual abuse, which is a humbling reminder to myself that when I'm thinking or talking about this topic, that there are survivors almost everywhere I look. So in preparing my remarks for today, the 3 of us were given three questions to really think through. And so I'm going to focus my comments in response to these questions about the challenges to accountability and healing when we do our best to learn from survivors and vulnerable communities. And I will say that when I have spent time listening to survivors, it has been just really heartbreaking to hear all the ways that the church has done its very best to deny, to minimize harm, to ascribe blame even to survivors themselves, to intimidate them, to keep them from telling the truth, to shame them, and to hinder or delay any ability to do actual truth-telling. I've lost count of the number of survivors who've been told me that they have been told to pray for their perpetrator, that when they disclosed abuse, that the church's main concern was that the priest invoke his vow of celibacy even more than any harm that he did to the survivor. And even bishops have reflected that when they were first learning about the scope of abuse, they primarily thought of this through the lens of sin and not as a crime. And so I was especially appreciative of Dr. Beste's remarks in the opening plenary that for too long, the church has really approached this issue as focusing only on minors as if, they were powerless or helpless or vulnerable adults, which, for some is a pretty condescending term to use, and has refused to acknowledge the inherent asymmetry and power conferred by ordination. That no sexual activity with a clergy person can really be consensual because of that power imbalance. And so I just wanted to share with you some of the stories that I've heard and what I've learned from walking with survivors. A number have talked about their abuse like the murder or rape of their soul. They talk about being left dead inside or saying, I am nothing. And over and again in our measures of moral injury, this experience of this betrayal of sacred trust or, having this vulnerability violated in such a profound way that in addition to the disorientation or the numbness or the sadness or the depression, there's really this overwhelming sense of futility, that their agency has been taken from them. And so many survivors say something to the effect of, I am nothing, or I was a dirty rag that no amount of bleach could clean. There's also a lot of hurt caused when survivors do try to tell their story and people are unwilling to really listen or to listen without judgment. So many survivors experience people who deny what they're trying to say and say, oh no, that must have been a misunderstanding, or I know that priest and he's a good guy. We know that sexual violence is almost always motivated more by power than by lust, and that predators trade on their charisma, on the fact that they they earn the trust of not only their victims, but of other people to kind of shield them from any kind of accountability. And so there's been a lot of outrage among survivors that lay people still aren't waking up, that they still don't really care, that they continue to be unmoved, which is why, Father Jerry, I really appreciated your remarks from Nuala. Enough is enough. We have to shake people out of complacency or out of this mistaken idea that this is just a few bad apples, that this is, as you pointed out, a broken system. And in my remarks, I also was spending time with Jim Keenan's recent article. It just came out on February 28th on hierarchicalism. So if you have access to theological studies, I'd recommend that because Jim does a great job looking at this through the structural lens of the problems of clericalism and hierarchicalism, especially in the way that clericalism disempowers lay people to really feel like they have much agency, even if they're not a victim survivor. I think part of what I've really learned about is that sense of futility has brought about a sense that there really isn't any hope for justice, kind of a fatalism that those wounds will never be healed. One survivor said, "You're still left with a broken heart until you die," and that there's really nothing that anyone can do to change that. I think something else that I've learned about from survivors is the impact that this has not only on them, but on their intimate bonds. As a moral theologian, I'm interested in what shapes us. And, I agree with Augustine that we become what we love, and that those most intimate bonds to us really have the farthest reaches in forming us. And there's so many survivors who did have marriages fall apart, or who've had their relationship with their parents or children or their siblings estranged because they struggled with this abuse. They didn't know how to handle it, or the people who told them that they loved them didn't understand why they couldn't just move on. And that's been a hard thing to hear so many times over, is how many survivors have been told, why don't you just let it go, or why don't you just move on? You're not helping yourself by staying in this moment of brokenness. What one survivor told me about his experience where he was finally ready to come forward and tell his abuse. And as we just talked about with the how problematic it is with the statute of limitations, according to the Archdiocese of Chicago, in that archdiocese, survivors wait on average 27 years after their abuse to come forward. And in one case, this gentleman finally felt ready to tell his story, and his lawyer asked him to write it all out, write down everything that happened. And he did. He wrote out a script of how he recalled the abuse, and he went for a walk to clear his head. And his son found the letter, and his son hadn't known anything about what his father had been carrying his entire life, and his son died by suicide because of the letter that he found. So to think about the ripples of harm that have been caused, it's not just specific to victim survivors themselves. There's so many people who are still now, hurting because of what has happened long ago. And, as Father Jerry said, even now people continue to be hurt. I think, one of the things that we know clergy sexual abuse is not just limited to a few bad apples. And I think part of what really makes this especially powerful is because of who the priest represents, right? The priest represents Jesus or God, that there's something sacred ascribed to this person. And that's why the intersection of, I think, spiritual and psychic and moral harm and relational harm is especially just potent because for so many survivors, they just don't understand how a representative of church or a representative of God could do this kind of harm to them, especially when so many of us are trained to just believe, whatever a priest says is right and true and good and just. And then on the other hand, to see how the church has behaved. I come from the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, where I was actually an altar server for a priest who was credibly accused of abuse, and he baptized my baby sister, who, after a lifetime of Catholic education, has decided not to get married in the church or not to baptize her children in the church, who wants nothing to do with the church because she still feels gross knowing that this man who molested little boys was the same man who baptized her and brought her into the church. And in my archdiocese, we had someone like Archbishop Dolan hiding $57 million in church assets, trying to move it to a cemetery to hide those assets so that he wouldn't have to, pay survivors from those funds. And when journalists called him on that, he said it was ludicrous or malarkey. He just roundly denounced it. And then when the federal judge unsealed those documents 6 years later, we had the evidence right in front of our eyes that, now Cardinal Dolan was doing exactly what the journalists accused him of doing, and he just blatantly denied it. And some studies suggest that across the country, the Catholic Church has shielded more than $2 billion in assets from survivors through these bankruptcy cases. And so I think, thinking about this question from Kim and David about what has the church, done or failed to do, or these challenges to learning, is, all the obfuscation, all the ways that the church has tried to hide the truth from people about, the scope of the harm that's happened. To rob people of the truth is to deaden the conscience. And as a moral theologian, I think it's worth pointing out that conscience, etymologically speaking, means to know together. And so if we don't know the truth of what's happened, then we're all operating with faulty conscience. So I think, the pattern of the church to defraud survivors, to hide assets, and to lobby to shorten the statute of limitations. In the U.S., again, the Catholic Church has spent more than $10 million on lobbyists to fight expanding the statute of limitations. That it really does, I think, undermine the moral credibility and the moral authority of the church. And that's also, I think, one of the wounds that's left, is trying to figure out, how do we know, these big questions about accountability and trust. When people are being betrayed over and over again, how do we know when we're ready to trust the church? When the church keeps denying basic necessities to survivors. There was a 2018 study from Johns Hopkins University that estimated that a survivor would need about $280,000 in assistance to cover the expenses of their counseling or therapy, or to make up for lost income over their lifetime to deal with the effects of their abuse. And most payoffs to survivors, which is not actually what I think survivors want when you listen to them. They want to be recognized, they want to be taken seriously. They don't want to be forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, which is very often what the church does, to keep them from being able to tell their story. That whatever money that they're able to give doesn't come close to actually helping to heal the wounds that they carry. So I don't want to take up any more time from Sarah Elizabeth, but I just wanted to close by thinking with that image that Pope Francis gives us when he introduced himself to the world. I don't know if you recall that interview he gave with America Magazine. It was entitled "A Big Heart Open to God," and he was kind of asked, "Okay, you're Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Who are you?" And he talked about being a beloved sinner and trying to build a church that was more like a field hospital than a fortress. And to think about how problematic that image is, not only because of the scale of the wounds that we're trying to tend to, you can't keep triaging in a battle. I mean, eventually there's just more wounds than we can heal. But also to think about how we need to change that model for when the church isn't only attending to wounds, but responsible for doing the wounding. And where else do we turn to try to bring about the healing that people so desperately need and deserve?
Thank you for that sobering reflection. Our next speaker is Sarah Gallagher. Sarah recently completed her Master of Divinity degree at the University of Notre Dame. She is from Ouray, Colorado, one of the most beautiful places in the world, and the traditional homeland of the Utah and Pueblo Indians, among other tribes. Prior to attending Notre Dame, Sarah worked at the St. Labre Indian Catholic School Dormitory in Ashland, Montana, serving among others the Northern Cheyenne and Crow tribes. Sarah currently works for the American Indian Catholic Schools Network here on Notre Dame's campus. Sarah and I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional homelands of multiple Native tribes, most notably the Pokagon Potawatomi. Finally, and most importantly, Sarah is currently a full-time stay-at-home mom to her 8-week-old son, Padraig. Congratulations.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Thank you for joining us today as we explore, and this weekend, as we explore these instances where we're called to hold ourselves more accountable to the work of healing the body of Christ. I'll be speaking about accountability, healing, and trust between the Catholic Church and Native American communities. The particular community I'm looking at is survivors of Native American Catholic boarding schools. First of all, it's important for me to name the lens from which I'm speaking on this topic. I'm a non-Native person who has been granted many privileges simply based on the color of my skin. And much of my knowledge and passion for this topic comes from living and working alongside Northern Cheyenne and Crow youth and elders for the 2 years that I lived in Ashland, Montana. I cannot know what it was like or is still like for those people who have survived Native American boarding schools. What I will briefly touch on today is not the solution to the problem. It's just one lens I think that could be helpful. Part of my vocation is to walk alongside these communities as a lay minister in the Catholic Church. Native American boarding schools were started by the United States government with the intention of suppressing the identity and culture of Native children and filling in that void with Western culture and religion. The first boarding school was opened in 1879 by a military man named Richard Henry Pratt, and he is quoted a multitude of times saying that the intention of the school was to kill the Indian but save the man. This was the general sentiment of the United States at the time, because instead of continuing to kill and remove Native people from their traditional homelands, in order for Europeans to move into those spaces, Pratt founded Carlisle Indian School in order to remove Native children from their culture and force them to assimilate. Carlisle Indian School has a notoriously difficult history and was the boarding school upon which all other boarding schools were modeled. Although Native American boarding schools were started by the United States government, very quickly Christian churches, including the Catholic Church, dove headfirst into this new system of education and assimilation. In 1887, St. Catherine Drexel established her first Native American boarding school with an eye towards running it differently. In order for children to attend government boarding schools, they were taken from their homes, often by force, and moved thousands of miles from their families. St. Catherine's goal was to open boarding schools located closer to reservations so that children could remain closer to home. However, the children were still expected to leave behind their language, culture, and religion. By the early 1900s, there are an estimated 300 Catholic Native American boarding schools in the United States. Upon arrival at boarding school, whether these were run by the government or the Catholic Church, children were expected to leave behind their traditional hairstyles, their traditional clothing, their traditional footwear, and their traditional languages. While at these schools, many children were neglected, physically or sexually abused, and sometimes food was even used as a weapon to gain compliance. Sadly, many Native children who died at boarding schools were buried in unmarked or mass graves. As you may have seen in the news over the past year, some of these graves have been uncovered in Canada, and as a result, a surge of requests have been made for ground-penetrating radar to be used on the lands of boarding schools run by the church and the government in both Canada and the United States. Though through Native American boarding schools, the church participated in a system of education that silenced Native people through the removal, re-education, and abuse of their children. Native voices continue to be buried today. In order to find healing between Native communities and the Catholic Church, I suggest we turn towards the lens of restorative justice. Restorative justice is one path that can help heal the body of Christ. Howard Zur, one of the founders of the movement, believes that restorative justice should be brought about by communities, through dialogue, and by applying the process to their own situations. In this case, we're speaking about Native Americans who have been silenced and harmed by the Catholic Church. These people who were harmed at the hands of ministers and missionaries of the church deserve to be heard and deserve to have a key role in developing rituals of healing in conjunction with the church. Restorative justice dialogue also calls for participation by those who have perpetrated the abuse. It may not be possible to find individuals who enacted these abuses at the boarding schools, and in that case, as the body of Christ, we're called to step into this dialogue and walk with those who are harmed by representatives of the institutional church. The institutional church is built on a lasting foundation which has been passed down from St. Peter and the apostles through their successors to the Pope and the College of Bishops today. It's essential that the Pope and bishops who speak for the Catholic Church take steps towards healing the wounds of those harmed at the hands of ministers in the church. In March of last year, I interviewed the Assistant Director of Native American Affairs at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He informed me that one of the first and foremost objectives of the Subcommittee on Native American Affairs is to hold these listening sessions with survivors. He named 5 things that he sees as important in these sessions. First, the listening sessions need to be culturally appropriate, especially because different tribes have different cultural norms. Second, he believes listening sessions need to be run by the Native American people in each community, and he sees himself as being present to listen and take orders and guidance, but as a representative of the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. Third, it has to be truthful. Some people had good experiences at boarding schools, and he believes that these stories aren't told often enough. And he recognizes that there were things that boarding schools could have done differently, but that they had a lot of expectations from the United States government, such as not being able to speak or teach in native languages. Fourth, these listening sessions must be forward-looking. We, the church, must learn what we can do to make sure that we don't repeat the problems of the past. And finally, he said there needs to be an apology, but that the apology must be the last thing the church does, because if the apology comes first, it could too easily come to people asking, well, we've apologized, what more do you want? He also said that the bishops have a role to play in these conversations, which could be, their role could be apologizing on behalf of the church or being active in these listening sessions. These 5 points gave me hope because I know that the USCCB is taking this topic seriously, but at the same time, I can clearly see that the church has much work to do. At the time of my interview with the assistant director, no listening sessions had been held. And during the interview, he informed me that the USCCB was waiting for the local Native communities to reach out and initiate the process. While the USCCB is approaching listening sessions this way, in order not to impose anything on Native communities, I believe the church needs to clearly welcome and include Native people in the development of the listening sessions that they hope for. The USCCB's hope for running listening sessions was to have Native Catholics from each community run the sessions and Native people come to share their stories with a representative of the church present, but not necessarily participating. While this is beautiful and maybe what some communities need, if we look at the restorative justice model, it's necessary for people who committed the harm to be part of the conversation too. And the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, as spiritual descendants of those who ran Catholic boarding schools, are also stakeholders in these conversations. If we look through the lens of restorative justice, we can see that the Catholic Church will likely discover two important things when considering listening sessions. First, the listening session can be opened up to supportive dialogue, not just listening and recording. These sessions need to be first and foremost a space to listen to those who have had experiences, whether good or bad, at Native American Catholic boarding schools. But the church, as stakeholder, should take part in conversations about the needs of Native communities. Yet the church cannot just listen. The church also needs to have an active part in identifying what her own obligations are in the process of healing. And second, the church herself has a very important role as a stakeholder in these conversations to tell her own story. Stories are very important in the restorative justice process. Not only the stories of those harmed, but also the story of the perpetrator. It is the responsibility of the church to research and open the truth of her story. If the church has recognized the importance of hearing the truth about those harmed at boarding schools, then the church cannot stand in the corner and simply listen. She has an obligation to come to the circle and truthfully tell her story. The truth of the church's story cannot be a defensive presentation of what happened at Native American Catholic boarding schools. The church needs to open and research historical records from boarding schools, and the institutional church needs to do her part to reveal the harm done and intentionally covered up at these boarding schools. On this point, 2 U.S. bishops recently wrote a letter to their fellow bishops urging them to cooperate with any requests they receive from the federal government for an investigation on abuses at these boarding schools. Another hopeful sign is that the USCCB has looked at the example of the Canadian government's response to boarding schools in Canada. In their response, the Canadian government met with a few First Nations tribes using a restorative justice approach referred to as peacemaking circles. If we look back again to the description of the Native boarding school history, we see that the voices of Native Americans were not considered in choosing how their Native religions or cultures would interact with Christian religion and European culture. If their voices and narratives are still not listened to now, it can be no wonder that many Native Catholics feel both inside and outside of the church, and that Native people are leaving the church angry about what was done to them and their ancestors. If the church does not tell the truth of her own story, including the stories of Native American Catholics, then we are missing out on the full extent of our own narrative. We have an obligation as the body of Christ to remember and tell stories of joy and triumph, as well as stories of failure and suffering. Otherwise, the people who experience this trauma may never be able to see how the church could also be their home. The final image I want to end this presentation with is the image of the church as wounded healer. This is an expansion of Henry Nouwen's image of the minister as wounded healer. He first says, "A Christian community is therefore a healing community, not because wounds are cured and pains are alleviated, but because wounds and pain become openings or occasion for new vision. Mutual confession then becomes a mutual deepening of hope." Next, he goes on to speak about the minister as healing his own wounds in preparation to heal the wounds of others. The church as minister is called to be the wounded healer. She's called also to be the one who must look at her own wounds, but at the same time be prepared to heal the wounds of others. I find in conversations about healing that involve the church, people often speak about the church reaching from within herself to the outside to heal people who have been harmed. And expanding Nouwen's image, I see that the church is not someone who needs to reach out from herself, but she's someone who needs to reach within to heal people who have been harmed and are stuck within the wounds of the church. The church is called to open the wounds of the body of Christ in order to find the suffering that is bound there. I believe that the members of the church who are silently suffering from the trauma experienced at Catholic boarding schools must be gently asked to share their stories so that healing may begin to take place. Through interviews that I conducted with people who were survivors of boarding schools, I found that often these Catholics were silently enduring their wounds, partially out of a love for the church. They didn't want to harm the image of the church by sharing their stories. The church needs to open listening sessions and dialogue around healing with their members who attended these boarding schools, because these men and women are hidden within the tightly bound wounds of the history of the church. This must be a conversation about a church who reaches within herself to find those who have been harmed, and in the process of opening these wounds, she will bring healing for the entire body of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, we have Elizabeth Polito Hernandez speaking. Elizabeth is a first-generation graduate social work student at St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota. She currently serves as a social work intern at Gracias Sagradas Community Mental Health in Minneapolis, Minnesota, whose mission is to accompany people who have experienced unimaginable pain and trauma as they move toward healing. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Organ and David and Kim for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will be sharing some stories that really unfold the experiences of sexual abuse survivors within the Latinx community. So there will be some triggering aspects of the experiences, so please feel free to go out, or people online if you want to mute it. But during my time at Raíces Sagradas Community Mental Health, serving the Latinx community, I have really become invested in both listening and validating the individual experiences that each individual we serve. And as a Latina who grew up in a Catholic parish, and as a social worker, I think it's really important to advocate and bring awareness to the social injustice issues that the community I both serve and am a part of are facing, including sexual abuse. And so that is why I am here today to empower and uplift the voices of the Latinx individuals who have been silenced for so long and have been restricted from having a seat at the table for way too long, who deserve not only a solution, but to be heard and understood. And so I hope that you can accompany me today by listening to the shared experiences of the individuals who I will be presenting today, and based on my own experience as a Latina in the Catholic parish. And so to start off, I would like for you to feel free to use your notepads and think of the qualities that make a great family, and think of what that structure looks like to you. It could be your own family, what makes your family great, or a family you've worked with, or anyone in your social group that you consider family, and what makes a great family. Think of those qualities. Write them down if you want. And some of the qualities you might come up with are that your family is loving, caring, supportive, compassionate. And now I would like for you to think of the great qualities that make up the Catholic Church, and how that Catholic Church can be like a family to you. And you may find that some of the qualities are similar to that of a family. They're supportive, caring, compassionate, and loving. And they're supposed to protect you, right? But now imagine what would happen when a family that is supposed to be protective and keep you from harm has a member within it that is causing you harm, that is hurting you. Would you feel protected, loved, cared for, valued? Validated? Most likely not. And unfortunately, that's what happens with many individuals in the Latinx community. Many are not protected. They feel disappointment. They feel that they have no one to turn to because the person that was, or the community that was supposed to care for them are the ones that are causing them harm. And so the Latinx community, being a very close-knit community, really views the Catholic Church as a family. And when that trust is broken, many of the sexual abuse survivors begin to question, what did I do wrong? Why was it my fault? What could I have done better to prevent this? And it's never, what did they do wrong? And why are they not doing what they need to? And so this is a common theme that we also see with the victims of sexual abuse who we serve at Raíces Sagradas Community Mental Health. Many of them who have also, in addition to the sexual abuse trauma, are also carrying the trauma of past childhood experiences, which only exacerbates and makes the feeling of trauma in the present time much more intense. And so in addition to the sexual abuse trauma, they also have to deal with this, but who's supporting them? If the support system that they thought was the best is the one that's also part of this issue. And so today I would like to cover 3 key factors of why sexual abuse victims and survivors within the Latinx community are silenced. And to start off, one of them is power and privilege, as we have seen with other panelists who have covered power and privilege within the Catholic Church. In the eyes of minority communities, especially in the Latinx community, we view the Catholic Church and its clergy and members as the utmost superior. And so when sexual abuse counts happen, we can't come forward and say, oh, you know what, well, they abused me. Because in our mind, we think that's a sin because this is a man of God or a person that's devoting their life to preaching the word of the Lord. And so we can't just say, you know what, they're doing this to us because we feel that we're sinning. We feel that we're the problem, when in reality, it's not like that. You know, they may be a man of God, but they're also the ones committing the sin, and they're the ones that are hurting us. And so this is stemming from a history of colonization when the conquistadors came to Latin America and made this turn to this imposition of religion upon the inhabitants of Latin America, and really created this division in power and made emphasis that, you know, we're the elite and everyone else is the poor. And so we see this carried on in the present, in our parishes, in my parish specifically, with the Latino community. We feel that we have to ask for permission to be part of the parish. We have to ask and we have to work twice as hard to earn our place in the community. And it shouldn't be like that because we're all part of the community. We're all part of the body of Christ. And we shouldn't have to ask for permission or work twice as hard to feel that we're deserving. And we also have limited resources within the community in our parish, and we're not able to have Bible studies. Like, for instance, there's one starting at my parish this weekend, and it's only in English. And so how can we become more invested in growing in our faith and enriching that faith if we don't have access to it? And so I think that in addition to that, if we're being excluded and then we experience sexual abuse by someone within the church, how are we supposed to advocate for ourselves if the door is being shut in our face? And so that is why this needs to end, this power, this division, because the only thing that's growing is the gap. It's not closing, it's just growing. And how long does it need to grow, right? And so another barrier that is faced within the Latinx community is the fear of the legal status. And this applies to both documented and undocumented immigrants within the Latinx community because they fear that if they report the sexual abuse, just because of the legal matters of it, they fear that their life could be in danger because they think that if they speak about this, they're gonna be in danger of being separated from their families or deported. And so many of them hold back from reporting. And many people, both in the clergy and in the ministries, are aware of this, and they use that to their power. And they use that to either threaten or continue silencing them and then continue perpetuating the abuse. And so, as a community, I think it's important that we emphasize that if a survivor of sexual abuse is willing to report, it will not jeopardize their legal status in the country, and that we will be there as a united community in Christ to support them and find solutions and to listen and be there. And one last barrier that is often also overlooked is the limited knowledge that the Latinx community has about sexual education and sexual abuse. Oftentimes within the community, the sexual education is very taboo. And so whenever there is any mention of sexual abuse, we tend to think, oh, it was rape and there had to be penetration. However, that's not true. It doesn't just have to be penetration for it to be sexual abuse. It can also be touching. And so that is one of the biggest barriers, because if we have this idea that, oh, it just has to be penetration, many people who have been touched and molested think, okay, well, this isn't sexual abuse. And so we're not going to report it, we're not going to question it, and we're just going to go on with our life. We're going to go on with the pain and the unhealed trauma. And it doesn't have to be like that. And a client of mine who I've been working with for about 6 months now reported, and it's very common with many other clients, that when she was growing up, her mother never taught her about sexual education, about that a period would be every month, or that you had to consent sex, or that if you did consent and then wanted to say no, after you had said yes, that would be fine. She didn't know that. And she didn't know what sexual abuse was. And so when her first sexual abuse encounter occurred when she was 9 years old by her brother, who just touched her while she was sleeping, she didn't know that it was wrong. She didn't know it was sexual abuse, and she never reported it, which then led on to a pattern of more sexual abuse by her later boyfriend years later. And she didn't know that she could report. And so she withstood this pattern and over and over and over. And she didn't know that she could stop this by reporting it, by telling someone. And another client of mine who I've also been recently seeing reported that her husband would force her to have sex with her. And every time she would tell him no, he would force himself on to her and would say that she was his wife and that was her duty because she was his wife and she had to do it. And she would feel dirty, sad, and devastated after each encounter. But she finally started to internalize that, you know what, I am his wife. I have to do this. I have to do this. And now that she's in therapy, she has started to kind of unwind from that and has started to learn that this is sexual abuse. And that just because she's married, it doesn't take away from the fact that it's rape and that it's sexual abuse. And so her response was, well, you know what, I thought that because I was married, that it wasn't sexual abuse. He's my husband and it's okay, it's normal to me. And it's not. And she said that she didn't think that sexual abuse applied to her because she was a married woman, that she thought sexual abuse only happened to children and young people who were abused by strangers. And so here we can see how both of these clients have this idea. One didn't know about sexual abuse, period. And then the other one only thought it applied to a certain group of people and made this notion in herself that, you know what, it happens to other people. It just doesn't happen to people like me, people who are married, people who are older. And so this limited knowledge also silences people. It silences people because they don't know. And I think that's one of the patterns that we see. And this carries on generation after generation. And so this cycle has to be stopped. And so what are the effects on the Latinx community within our parishes? Latinx survivors of sexual abuse tend to not report. it is very possible that they may continue seeing their perpetrator in church. And this does not just only apply to the clergy, but it could also be ministry members or any member of the parish. And this also means that not reporting means having no access to any resources within the parish of support, they have no spiritual support, and having no spiritual support or mental health support can lead to depression, generalized anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. And untreated sexual abuse trauma can pass from one generation to the next, in the sense that parents might start taking out that feeling, that anger, that frustration that they have maybe towards a perpetrator in the church that didn't back them up. They take that out on their children, on their families, and that only creates a new cycle of trauma for that family, and it's ongoing and ongoing, and it doesn't stop until someone speaks up. And how many years does that take? And why should it take that long? And then others tend to leave the church. Others feel that with the rise of cases in sexual abuse, there's no point in being part of the church because they don't have that support and they won't have the support. And so why risk it? A client reported that when he was an altar boy, he would witness the sexual abuse of other children who were also altar boys. He himself was sexually abused, and he would see as the priest would put his hands up the skirts, up the pants and legs of little kids. And he remembers that when he tried to talk about this to the parents in the parish and tell them that the priest was doing this to them, they told him to shut up. They told him that he was crazy and that he didn't know what he was talking about. And he said that since that moment, he decided to never speak up about this. But in that moment, he left his faith and he left what he believed in. He doesn't want to associate with the church anymore because associating with the church means that he's also supporting the perpetrator that abused him and thousands of other children. And so this is an issue because not only does this happen to this client, it's happened to many, many other people. And many other people are leaving the church. And why are they leaving the church? Because they're not protected. They're not listened to. They're not understood. And they're not provided the support that they need. And so I think that as people of the church, as clergy members, and as ministry members, we have the duty to do our best to not let these people go, but most importantly, to support and listen, to listen and understand. And as a devout Catholic that I am, it's very heartbreaking that nothing is being done or not enough is being done. And I think that in the Latinx community, we don't tend to ask for the support because we feel like, again, with that power and privilege, we feel the necessity to always be asking to do things. But when it comes to our pain and trauma, it's something we tend to avoid. And it's something that we don't want to ask for help. We don't. And so I think that as a community in a parish, we have the duty to engage as much as we can by being here and looking not only for solutions, but looking for ways in which we as a parish can be there to support a member when they come up to us and say, I was sexually abused or I'm being sexually abused, not just by clergy, by ministry, by anyone. We have to be ready to respond. We have to be trained and capacitated in order to respond to them in the moment and not say, okay, this is not my problem. It's not the problem of the parish. It's not the problem of the Catholic Church, and pass it on to someone else. We have to be prepared to be there spiritually and ready to offer the resources necessary, whether it's mental health resources, whether it's attorney services, whatever they may need, we have to have that on hand, but we also have to have our toolkit ready to say, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna pray together and we're gonna sit here and I'll support you through the report. We'll be there if we need to be there. And that way we can show our support. We can show up as a Catholic Church and say, you know what? we have this and we're going to support you. And in that way, I think that we can do better, and we'll do better on the spot. We might not change the entire world, but it'll be one parish at a time, one member at a time. And that way we can engage back the community that we're losing. And just to end off, something that's always said in my parish, I don't know if you guys listen to it in any other parish, but at my parish at least, they always say that the Latinx community is the future of the church. And I would like to say that no, we are not the future of the church. We are the present of the church, and we need to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have about 20 minutes for questions if anyone would like to come up.
This is for all three of you. And we mentioned it at the first panel. We know that clerical life is soaked in alcohol. And I would love to hear from the three of you what you have heard from the stories of those who have been abused about how you perceive the role of alcohol in clerical life, in the abuse, or however you would like to frame that.
I can start. Yeah, so you're right. I mean, what starts maybe innocently enough with people wanting to entertain the pastor can become quickly a coping mechanism, or a way to deal with or escape from really powerful feelings. A way to numb. And so, certainly there have been a good number of survivors who, were plied with alcohol, to make consent much harder or even impossible, or to be part of that pattern of blame. If you were intoxicated, how can you be sure what happened? So yeah, I think you're right that the way that we are kind of allergic to addressing how problematic alcohol abuse or and other substances are part of the clerical life, and even just maybe part of Catholic culture. That I'm thinking of St. Patrick's Day coming up, where we normalize substance abuse in some ways and don't see the way that it's very often linked to sexual coercion, or a way for people to cope or to numb the pain that they're carrying. That we do need to have more open conversations. I think too, it would be interesting. I haven't seen any data on this, but given the way that we've seen these patterns of abuse in the church, sexism and heterosexism and racism, where predators go after vulnerable people, whether it's because of their gender identity or sexual orientation, or very often predators were moved to communities of color or low-income communities where people weren't able to, probably weren't as likely to report. That you often see a correlation there between, the survivor victims being plied with gifts or with alcohol, or like even especially if they were underage, like, look what a special treat it is that I'm letting you drink, or that we're gonna do drugs together, whatever this is, and that because of all those, the intersectionality of the power imbalance and those various identities, that it became that much harder also for survivors to come forward because they did participate in drinking underage or taking illicit drugs. And so it was also a way to kind of make the survivor feel complicit, even though of course it was never their initiative. But I will say too, just in walking with survivors, how hard it is to hear how many of them have turned to substances as a way. They don't know where else to turn to cope or to numb the pain. And when people think, that survivors are just looking for money because they're trying to get something for the church, I don't think enough people really understand that that this is part of what healing takes. Survivors are really frustrated. At least the survivors that I've listened to are really frustrated. You know, they say things like, what else do I need to do for the church to accept me and everything that I need? And to take seriously the ways in which that recovery could last a lifetime, especially if it includes any degree of substance abuse.
Yeah, no, I think that was spot on. I think personally from the clients that I have seen, they use it as a coping mechanism. Sorry, and not just only to numb the feeling, but sometimes it's because they're so numb inside already because no one has listened to them, and they completely have this emotional shutdown and this avoidance. And so in order to start feeling again, or at least that's what they think, they try to consume alcohol, because when they're buzzed or they feel that little buzz, they feel like they've come back to life. But how long does that last? And then, as tolerance increases in the body, they have to continue consuming and consuming more and more and more until it becomes a problem. So then in addition to the trauma you have, you add substance abuse. And so you mix that all up and it gets even worse. And there's no support. So if there's no support, you're in the situation. And then, like, for instance, the clients I see who are primarily immigrants and some aren't documented, they face other issues that could lead them to legal trouble and therefore deportation. So it's just a big mix and a whole load of problems for them.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with this topic or with my specific topic in alcohol. But just thinking about Native American communities in general, there's a lot of alcoholism, issues with alcohol and drug use. And the community that I worked with in Montana, there were stories of the priest who had not founded the school, but he had been sent to shut it down, and he was able to fundraise enough money to keep it open and had stayed there. There were stories that he had drank a lot with people at the parish and things along those lines, gone to parties when that wasn't really something he was supposed to be doing. And then when I was there were also reports coming to light that he had been abusing children as well. So I think it's very interrelated.
Yeah, I just think it's really fascinating. I mean, I've been a priest for 39 years, and in the 80s, we had alcoholism policies, and religious communities upheld that. We were all aware about what to look for, how to, just how to see that in the life of our brothers, right? And I think a lot of that's gone. I mean, and I think that's a real problem, at least in our community, my community, the community I belong to. The alcoholism policy is gone. So I don't exactly know why, but it's kind of outlived itself. But I think it's a real problem when we begin to look at our behavior and the accountability that we have from brother to brother, right? And especially when you see that so much of the abuse has happened through the years through the lens of alcohol, or the alcohol is part, so much a part of the abuse happening. I think it's a really interesting thing to look at, to study, to determine the role of alcohol and those who have abused today. So.
First of all, thank you for your presentations. I was really just captured by so many of the issues, both the Latinx and the Native American, Native peoples communities. And I guess there are two questions. The first is, Marcus, you were mentioning those survivors who come forward that you didn't expect. And I'm just wondering about, did they ever report their abuse to the Catholic Church or to the Jesuits or to religious order and what happened in that regard. Then secondarily, how then do we support those in both of these sort of underserved populations, the ability to really report and to facilitate that reporting? Because I think it's a really critical issue that our numbers are severely deficient in really addressing it. The bishops are proud to say, well, we have all of these, cases that come forward, but in reality, they never mention the fact of the data and the FBI suggesting that, well, really only 85 to 90% of sexual assault victims come forward. So how can we have predictive data, that we can depend upon? So be curious about your feedback on that.
Yeah, I don't have enough time to talk about the reporting process. It's a mess. I wish I could use a vulgarity. Yeah, I mean, it fills me with great despair. I have to say, my Marquette classmate and dear friend Sarah Larson at Awake Milwaukee, who's on a panel tomorrow, has done phenomenal work with survivors, and she gives me enormous hope, and the Awake Milwaukee community gives me great hope. But walking with survivors and hearing them struggle with whether or not to report, I try to draw on my training, through the Title IX office at Xavier University and put survivors in the driver's seat always. Making sure that they're making the decisions that are right for them in that moment. But the times that they have asked me to try to be an advocate or an ally, it has never been effective. I have called archdiocesan offices to ask about the status of an investigation, and they will say things like, we're aware of this complaint and no one will talk to you about that. Even if I make it clear that I'm working with this person. There are cases that get handled like an HR issue, and they'll, the archdiocese will farm out investigations to people who don't understand the power dynamics of clergy sexual abuse, of what difference it makes, that this isn't just an HR issue. It might have happened in a workplace, but it's not the same as, in a secular setting. And so I think it's gravely disappointing, at least in my experience, that the way the church is tripping over itself to avoid transparency and accountability. I mean, making every possible effort to protect and enable perpetrators and to discredit abusers. I can't believe the number of times where survivors were gaslighted, and made to feel that they, to use your word, crazy. Yeah. That the truth of their experience is not credible, and the reputational damage that these people endure because then that's spread. And I have to tell you, there are a lot of survivors who I know who will never come forward to talk about their abuse because they have seen the way that we treat collectively as a country, the way we treat survivors. I mean, we can all think of examples, right, of the ways in which survivors, when they do very courageously come forward to try to tell the truth of what has been done to them, that they are, treated in really disrespectful and insensitive ways. So yeah, I mean, one of the questions David posed to us was, what lessons have you learned? And we're doing more things wrong than we're doing right. I mean, we can't rest until the church is a safe place, and it's still very far from being a safe place because it still cares way more about its reputation than what the truth of what has actually been happening in our churches, or the degree to which people are actually safe right now. And just one example, I was hoping Miriam would talk about this. In canon law 536 and 537, it says that every parish has to have a financial council and a parish council, but the canon law says that they are consultative bodies. That's it, right? Like, the clericalism is written into canon law. We can't talk about co-responsibility or transparency or accountability unless and until canon law is changed, because lay people really do have absolutely no power, except what Dr. Bestie said at the very end, public outrage or going, trying to fight this in the public square. I've been tempted to go, and scream into the void, or contact journalists when church officials just, circle the wagons and protect one another, or say, this is a golden boy. There's no way we're going to let him be susceptible to any of these claims. And so they just move him around, or, change the story, whatever it is. We're really far from any kind of codification of co-responsibility or accountability or transparency. And I think that's true, because of the way we have the separation of church and state in this country, that so many times this is handled only, as an ecclesial matter and not enough as a civic matter. But in both cases, both in, the court system and in the church, there's also just an intentional delay at every turn. There's a case in Milwaukee where Archbishop Dolan alerted about a priest who was abusing, and the Vatican didn't write him back for 4 years. And our court system isn't really that much more expedient. I mean, a little bit more, but not that much more.
Can I clarify, were you asking how individuals can respond better
How can we support individuals to come forward?
in Native communities? That's a great question. I think, and you touched on this, but I think that believing people is probably the biggest thing that we can do. And like speaking about the truth and finding the truth of what happened at Native American boarding schools, and being able to open records. The Catholic Church is often the last people to want to open boarding school records. If they even recorded how many children died or what their names were, I think believing, and also calling for research to be done for the church to open these records, so that it doesn't have to just be individual stories, individuals who are stepping up and saying, this is what happened to me, but that the church needs to tell her story too. We need to hold ourselves responsible and open that space of truth without relying on just individuals stepping up and having to speak.
Sarah, I have a follow-up question for you. I think you said that the USCCB was suggesting that the Native persons should initiate the peace circles and discussions. I mean, that seems a bit ridiculous. Why not the USCCB initiate the peace circles?
Yeah, that's.
Could you repeat her question, because it has to be in the microphone for that?
Oh.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So my question for Sarah was, I heard you suggest that the USCCB assert or ask that the Native persons initiate the peace circle discussions. Why can't the USCCB make that initiative as part of telling the story?
Yeah, that's definitely a critique that I have, or something that I disagree with. The intention behind that, as was shared with me, is that the USCCB doesn't want to be telling Native communities what the solution is, which in some ways I respect. But if the Native communities don't know that it's an option for them to share their stories, or they don't feel as if the church will listen, which is what I heard from people in my interviews, is that they just didn't think the church would be willing to listen. So I think it's very important that the USCCB make statements or offer these spaces. So yeah, that's a critique that I have as well.
And then just to add on with the Latinx community, I think one of the first things, and I think it could apply to any other community, is being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that's one of the things, if we look at the power and privilege that is attributed to the Catholic Church in general, I think we have to be uncomfortable with letting go of that reputation of being, what even is a reputation anymore, right? There's so many cases of sexual abuse coming up, and it's kind of tainting that reputation already. So we have to ask ourselves, what is that what reputation do we want to have, right? And so I also think that in the communities, in the parishes, I think that priests, who are supposed to be the spiritual guides, can also be that guide when doing a report. And so I know many might not be familiar with the process, or if they are, they choose not to engage because it's not my problem, right? And so I think it is our problem because it's a member of our community. And I think that they should have the responsibility to say, okay, I'm going to accompany you. If you're going to make the call, I'll be there by your side. We can pray together before you do it. We can pray after it. And then we can continue following up. Even though the process is going to be very funky, very messy, might not have a solution, but you're still going to be there. And so I think being that spiritual guide, not just only in the church, but outside of the church is going to be helpful. And how that looks like, it's going to be different for every parish. But in a perfect world, I think that it would be really great to have that, not just only as a spiritual support, but also as an emotional support too. And so I think that would be a really great approach. And I think that the training for it should also be emphasized, and that there should be also training offered for the parish members, because within the Latinx community, there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of minimizing and insensitivity when it comes to the survivors of sexual abuse. And sometimes it's not just because we're trying to single out and point people, but it's also because of our own reflection of traumas that we might have. And so that silence that we also carry with maybe other sexual abuse that we've experienced comes out, and we single out people who have also been abused.
Thank you all to our panelists. We appreciate you being here.